What if I told you that we are witnessing one of the biggest failures in NFL history? But it's not even the player's fault. Bryce Young was one of the highest rated quarterbacks to ever come into the NFL, and after leaving an NFL factory like Alabama, everybody expected him to be a generational talent, including the Carolina Panthers, who were expecting huge things to come with this draft pick. But in his first 2 seasons with the team, he has been nothing but disappointing, and he has been one of the most disappointing picks that the NFL has ever had. But is that really Bryce Young's fault? Or has it been the fact that the Panthers are one of the worst-led organizations the NFL has ever seen? But before we get to the downfall of Bryce Young's career, we have to go all the way back to Santa Ana, California, where he played high school football. Young was a star athlete for the best high school football program to ever exist, modern day. Now, if you're like me and played high school football all throughout high school, I'm positive that you've heard of this high school before. It's a college football factory, as they average just over 25 D1 recruits every single season. You simply just don't see that anywhere else. And Bryce Young was no different, being the top recruit coming out of his high school class. He had offers from every single major Division I program in the country, but it only felt right for the best player in the country to go to the best team in the country, the University of Alabama. The then Nick Saban-led Tide were one of the best programs for developing young quarterbacks and sending them to the NFL. I mean, look at the 3 guys that were before Young: Jalen Hurts, Tua Tagovailoa, and Mac Jones. All 3 of those quarterbacks with whom made it to the NFL. Now, I mean, Mac Jones might be a career backup, and Tua should medically retire here any minute now, but at least Jalen Hurts is pretty good. But the second that Bryce Young stepped on campus, he made a huge impact for Alabama, playing in only a few games as just a true freshman, but unfortunately, he would have to back up Mac Jones for the most of the 2020 season. But in 2021, Bryce Young would finally get his shot at being a starter for the Tide. He was nothing short of dominant, throwing for 47 touchdowns to only 7 interceptions, and would lead this Alabama football team all the way to the national championship, but then would unfortunately lose to the Georgia Bulldogs with a final score of 33-18. But even with this loss, Young was still considered the best player in all of college football and would go on to win the Heisman Trophy that same season, beating out players like Aiden Hutchinson and CJ Stroud. It's safe to say that Young was one of the best players in the entire country and the best quarterback prospect in all of college football. And going into 2022, we should all get to see if he could keep up the dominance. In 2022, Bryce Young would take a minor step back, only throwing for 32 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. And he was not considered one of the best players in college football and would not be a Heisman finalist, as Caleb Williams would win the Heisman this year. And the Tide would also not be one of the best teams in the country, not even making the college football playoffs. But they would go on to beat Kansas State in the Sugar Bowl this season. This was an overall disappointing season for the Tide, but that did not deter Young, because he already knew he was going to the NFL. Going into the 2023 NFL Draft, there were 2 candidates that could possibly go number 1: Ohio State's quarterback CJ Stroud and Alabama's quarterback Bryce Young. All the way through the draft process, including the NFL Combine, these 2 players were neck and neck. People were concerned with Stroud's game managing skills, and scouts were concerned with the size of Young, and specifically the size of his hands, but I don't really understand why. But it was safe to say that both the Panthers and the Texans would get their new franchise quarterback, as they both had the first 2 overall picks in the NFL Draft. Well, to almost nobody's surprise, the Carolina Panthers would draft Bryce Young with the first overall pick. And of course, the Texans would draft CJ Stroud with the second overall pick. And the Panthers could not have been more excited for what everybody thought would be a franchise quarterback. Well, they would be horribly wrong. Bryce Young would come in the NFL with a chip on his shoulder, with scouts commenting on his height, saying that he wouldn't be able to see over his offensive line. Okay, maybe no scouts said that. Maybe it was just me. Anyways, but going on to his rookie year, he was one of the highest touted rookies in the entire NFL, and the expectations were sky high for this quarterback. But there was one little issue that he would face for his entire first year. The Panthers had one of the worst rosters surrounding Young that they could possibly ever have. They had one of the worst offensive lines that the NFL has ever seen. Their receivers could barely even be described as receivers. I mean, their number 1 option was Adam Thielen. That's the first issue. But the entire 2023 NFL season could be described as the worst possible starting season a quarterback could ever imagine, starting all games for this horrible Panthers team, as they would only win 2 games, and Bryce Young would throw for 11 touchdowns to only 10 interceptions. I mean, this performance has got to go down as one of the worst things I've ever seen. And seeing that he had absolutely zero help on both offense and defense, you really can't say it's his fault. Like, he literally was sacked more than any other quarterback in the entire league that season, and he was still supposed to be a mobile quarterback. But once again, the Carolina Panthers had the first overall draft pick, but decided to trade it away to the Chicago Bears for a lot more draft picks in that exact same draft. the Panthers would go on to draft 3 weapons on this offense that could potentially help Bryce Young, including one of the fastest and biggest receivers the NFL had ever seen in Xavier Legette, one of the best running backs in the entire class in Jonathan Brooks, probably the most underrated draft pick of them all in the 4th round being tight end Jatavion Sanders. Things were finally looking up for this horrible organization. But when you realize they still have a bottom 5 defense in the entire NFL, and an offensive line that I don't think could block a single high school athlete, and a quarterback with the pressure of the world on his shoulders, I don't really see what could possibly go wrong in year 2 for this quarterback experiment. Well, a lot could go wrong, so strap in. Well, his second year wasn't any better, with his team only still winning 5 games and Young throwing for 15 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. He surely was not living up to the expectations that all these Panthers fans and front office had for him going into his rookie year. Not to mention that he was also benched for Ginger Jesus for a portion of this year as well. But if we take a look at the person who was drafted just 1 pick behind him, CJ Stroud has already led this Texans team to 2 playoff appearances in just 2 years, and also being the youngest starting quarterback to ever win a playoff game. It really doesn't get much better than that. So it's safe to say that the experiment of Bryce Young is probably one of the worst things the Panthers could have done. Or maybe it's just entirely too early to tell. But whatever it may be, the Panthers are still one of the worst franchises in the entire league, and I truly don't believe that Bryce Young will be a starter in Carolina for very much longer. But hey, at least he's not this guy.